Thanks so much for joining us today, Dr. Preller.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be able to talk to you.
I'm really looking forward to this chat. I would love if you could talk to us a little bit about, just start with the basics. If you could talk about a little bit about the chemical composition of LSD and the structure.
Yes. So LSD in general is a pretty complicated molecule, actually, especially compared to other psychedelics. And that is because it stimulates a lot of serotonin receptors. And additionally to that, it also stimulates, or at least it has affinity to dopaminergic receptors. Now, we conducted a study where we actually tried to understand which kind of receptors are most important for its effect on a subjective behavioral level as well as on a neural level. And what we found out in these studies is that it is mainly the serotonin 2A receptor that is important for the effects of LSD, at least at the doses we administered. So we administered 100 microgram. And therefore, it is kind of similar to other psychedelics, which also mainly stimulate the serotonin 2A receptor. Um, yeah, so that is basically the receptor pharmacology. A lot of receptors involved, probably, but most importantly, the serotonin 2A receptor.
Okay, and now you mentioned the dopaminergic receptor is also involved. Is there, I know that there are other compounds that interact with that receptor that have addictive qualities, if I understand that correctly. Is there any of that same, like, maybe possibility or risk with LSD because it interacts with that receptor?
So we don't think so. In our studies, we've seen that while the dopaminergic receptors did not necessarily contribute to the effects, because when we block the serotonin to a receptor, basically all of the effects were gone. Um, it's like people basically had, the same effects as they had on a placebo dose, which had no active compound at all in them. So all of the effects were gone when we blocked the serotonin to a receptor. We didn't see any effect of, or residual effects when we gave the blocker first. So for the time being, we don't have any evidence that the dopaminergic receptors really play a major role in the effects of LSD. And also, together with the interaction of the serotonin receptors, we know that if you take LSD, well, one day and then you try it again on the next day, there are almost no effects, mainly because we develop a certain tolerance through the serotonin 2A receptors. So it is basically impossible to get addicted to LSD just because you cannot use it on a daily basis. And also on a psychological level, I mean, people really don't want to use psychedelics repeatedly in a short amount of time because I mean, the effects are really much more like a roller coaster and not the euphoric effects that you get with some other drugs. So these are the reasons why we don't think that LSD is addictive.
Yeah, I'm glad you addressed that. I appreciate that because I think, a lot of the people who listen to this podcast are medical professionals, and very often with these substances or with anything that we classify as a drug, that is, thanks to the war on drugs, the first thing we think of is like, this is addictive and this is going to fry your brain in some way. And so I always love to address the addictive potential or lack thereof so that people can put that more into context. So, if I understand correctly, this has maybe some analog to MDMA, where if you are taking it one day, then maybe you use up your serotonin in a way that the next day you don't necessarily have the replenished serotonin supplies to make it have the same effect.
So with psychedelics, it's a little bit different. The mechanism of action is a bit different from MDMA, whereas MDMA mainly works as a releaser and inhibits the transport back into the vesicles. Um, Psychedelics really stimulate the receptors themselves. So basically, they replace what serotonin is usually doing on the receptor and stimulate it directly. Um, but however, this still has the effects that it probably overstimulates those receptors and then they can internalize. So they are not as available as they usually are the day or the days after you had a psychedelic experience. And that's why you probably don't feel the effects the next day.
I appreciate that clarification. That makes significantly more sense. Okay, so once it itself has flooded the receptor is not quite as available. Okay. All right. Now that we've got some of the biochemistry down, I'd love to hear a little bit about the research you all have done there on LSD and its effects.
Yes, so we conducted one large study with LSD. As I said before, we were on the one hand obviously interested in the effects of LSD, but we were also interested in the receptor chemistry or the contribution of different receptors. That's why in this study we had our participants come in 3 times plus a screening visit, of course. And the 3 testing days were either placebo or LSD plus a pre-treatment with catenzarin, which is blocking the serotonin 2A receptors. And well, after administration of these substances, we mainly had them in the brain scanner twice a day, actually, because the effects of LSD last so long. We had a lot of time to do experiments together with the participants. So we had them in the brain scanner. We looked at their resting state brain connectivity, just to basically figure out what these drugs are doing in the brain when the brain is not challenged with a specific task. But we also looked at different things, like, for example, social cognition. So we're very interested in how psychedelics can modify social cognition, because that is a big part of human life in general, and it's also a big part, a key criterion actually for psychiatric diagnosis, and one where we don't have any therapy for right now, at least no pharmacological therapy. So we were specifically interested in social cognition as well. And then we did another few experiments on general cognition, like, for example, working memory and those things. And again, also how they depend on the serotonin 2A receptor.
And so I'm always curious when psychedelic studies have a pure placebo. I'm assuming that that there's a giant difference. They know they've gotten the placebo that day. Are they given anything else? Like, I know in some studies they're given niacin or something, maybe to make it feel like something is happening.
Yes. So I mean, the blinding issue is obviously is a huge issue in psychedelic research. However, I think with the studies we have been conducting, it might not necessarily be such a big issue, for various reasons, and I'll try to walk you through them. So, um, in this specific study, for example, we had 2 conditions where basically nothing was happening. So again, people could not necessarily differentiate between the placebo condition and the catenzarin plus LSD condition. So at least this condition was pretty much blinded. Then on the other hand, LSD, I mean, it has very strong psychotropic effects. So of course, some people were certainly able to tell which drug they had been administered. But for the tasks we were doing, it doesn't necessarily matter too much. So if you're thinking about, just lying still in an MR scanner and we're measuring their brain activity, I mean, you can't do anything about it, whether you know if it's LSD or not, right?
Yes.
So we try to do the experiments in a way where it's not, I mean, it doesn't matter too much if they know or if they don't know. And the reason why we don't necessarily use active placebos, at least in these, mechanistic studies where we also do brain imaging, is because while these drugs, they do something with your brain too, right? I mean, they have psychotropic effects. And here, if you use that and then compare it in the brain scanner to, something that also has some kind of activity, then we're lacking a real baseline. And even though if the blinding gets a little bit better with using an active placebo, we're kind of getting rid of, the baseline that we need for these studies. So that's why for those studies we went for an inactive placebo. But then again, for other studies where we're talking about clinical effects, for example, there the blinding and the active placebo makes much more sense, of course, than in the mechanistic studies that we've been conducting.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I completely understand. Can you talk a little bit about what you found? I'm very interested to hear about, you were looking at the brain connectivity, but then also you mentioned social cognition. And so was that something that you could see on the brain scans, or was that like a survey that they did afterward?
So we try to well, we always try to do both, like getting the subjective experience of the participants as well as objective measures where they perform tasks. And with regard to, for example, with psychedelics, so we've tested the psilocybin as well as LSD. We've done both. We had people while lying in the scanner doing social experiments where they were, for example, interacting with other participants, and at one point they were excluded from a game. And we tested on the one hand how their brain reacted to this exclusion, and obviously we also asked them how they felt. We did another task as well where they were, well, not in the brain scanner, but sitting in front of a computer screen, and we were measuring the empathy there. And of course, then we also use, like scales where they basically tell us how they feel. So we're always trying to look at these things from, different angles to, get the most complete picture as possible.
That's very cool. So if you could tell us a little bit about what your studies found, what the findings were.
Yeah. So, well, where do I start? so,
Anywhere you'd like. Let's hear them all.
so well, I mean, we were just talking about social cognition. So with social cognition, we found that, first of all, um, psilocybin decreases this rejection sensitivity. So people were not, they didn't react as much to being excluded. And the reason why we think this is important is because in psychiatric disorders, these patients often have an increased rejection sensitivity. So if you think about a depressed patient, for example, these patients sometimes just walk well through the world thinking negatively about themselves, and also thinking that other people think negatively of them. And um, and we've seen in various studies they react more strongly to social exclusion than healthy control participants did. So this is one of the things where we think that it could have a really beneficial effect on social cognition in, for example, a depressed patient population, and might help them to reconnect with their social environment, which is incredibly important because, on the one hand, the therapeutic process itself is a social one. And on the other hand, while your social environment will also provide the support that you need to get better. And that's why we think this is a really important aspect. And yeah, so that's one of the results. The other one is it also increases empathy, for example. And again, same logic here. Increases in empathy will probably be very helpful to reconnect with your social environment. So those are the main results on the social cognition part.
And you said that was for psilocybin. Is that for LSD as well?
So we haven't tested exactly the same thing with LSD, unfortunately, because I mean, obviously there's limited time. Um, but what we've seen with LSD is that there is a blurring between the perception of oneself and the perception of other people. And we assume that these blurring of this differentiation between, this is me and this is you, may contribute to, well, this increased connectedness that some people report, or at least a lot of people report, like being connected with your social environment and sometimes with, the whole world. And there we've seen that there are specific areas in the brain which are usually differentiating between this is me and this is another person. And this differential activity is reduced under the influence of LSD.
Interesting. I love that. I mean, a lot of these psychedelics have us feeling more one with nature, more one with our surroundings, and I love that you were able to actually quantify that that feeling. Now, what about the other areas? Like you were talking about working memory and the other things that you saw on the scans.
Yes. So with the scans, where I've been talking about resting state, for example, in the beginning. So with our resting state scan, so where we just were interested in, well, what are these drugs doing in the brain itself, when it's not challenged. So here we really wanted to get to understand, well, the mechanism. How do they work? How do they bring about these, very unique effects that they have? And what we've seen there, first of all, is, well, that one mechanism probably underlying the psychedelic state is that the thalamus, which is an area that usually filters the information that we get from within ourselves as well as our environment through our senses, that the thalamus seems to not be able to filter this information as it usually does. And there's an increased connectivity between the thalamus and certain areas of our brain, in the cortex. So this might be a first step where you say, like, well, this filter function is reduced in a way. There's not necessarily a complete sensory overload because it is sending more information to specific areas of the brain. And then what we've seen after that is that there is a disbalance between areas in the brain which are responsible for our sensory perception, like hearing, seeing, etc., and areas which are supposed to integrate this information into a coherent picture. So what we've seen there is that there is increased connectivity between these sensory regions, which kind of makes sense because, as I just said, there is, probably more information reaching the cortex, which comes from our senses, and the psychedelic experience is a very, very sensory state, right? But the way we then put these information together is very different. And here we've seen that the areas which are supposed to integrate this information, they're very loosely connected to the rest of the brain. And we think that this is really a mechanism that could underlie the psychedelic state, like increased sensory experience, but a completely different way of bringing them together as a coherent picture. And that could obviously also help, again, patients which might be struggling with rigid thinking patterns, like, rumination, being forced to always you know, think about the same things over and over again. And then here we kind of can, break out because we put the information together in a new way. And this might help to break out of these rigid thinking patterns and, look at the world and look at oneself in a very new way.
I was going to ask because you got me thinking with the whole connectivity. That made me think about why people take microdoses of LSD is that they're saying, okay, it helps me focus or it helps me be more creative. And that creativity sounds like what you're describing in the brain is that like new connections are being formed that maybe otherwise wouldn't. Do you think that's some of what underlies that increase in creativity?
So I'm trying to be a bit careful about that because we haven't yet talked about the general cognitive results yet.
Oh,
So what we found there with LSD is that unfortunately things like working memory, but also in a way flexible thinking, is actually decreased on a full dose of LSD, which is a bit contrary to other results, or also what people have been reporting themselves. Um, so I think we might be talking about, maybe two different things or maybe even two different states here, because a lot of people I think experience um, this creativity more in the afterglow or the post-acute effects. So these people might be able to use, the experience they had in the acute during the acute phase as an inspiration, um, to actually then get more creative afterwards. But in this actual psychedelic state, when you have this really, when you're very emotional, when you have like all of these, sensory experiences, it doesn't necessarily seem that like this is the state where you're actually, you know, super flexible, highly functioning, very creative. But maybe after that, this is where you know, start using the experience, and have this, you know, creative experience after that.
Interesting.
Because
Go ahead.
on the, yeah, so now I'm talking obviously about, you know, a full dose of LSD, a very psychedelic dose. um with with these microdoses, it's been a little bit more difficult. So the studies which are out there right now, they also have not necessarily shown any alterations in cognitive flexibility or concentration and these things like that. Um, but then again, there are currently no studies out there which test like repeated dosing and these things. So most of these studies, and there are very few right now, only tested, you know, one administration of a very low dose of LSD.
Okay, good to know. And you had said that your findings as far as the cognitive function were different from what others had found?
So not necessarily. Um, so the impairments in cognition in general, they have been shown by at least one other group. Um, but the with regard to, well, what we call creativity, this is a bit of a difficult concept because it's really hard to measure. So what does count as creative, right? And a lot of people use these tasks where you say like, well, I'll tell you green, and what is the first thing that comes to your mind, which is probably a lemon or something like that. And then they try to measure the distance between, you know, what you said and what would be expected. And this can be, you know, this can indicate a certain creativeness. But in general, as you can see just from this example, it's really terribly hard to measure something like creativity. Others have tried in the early days, in the 60s, have tried um to look at musicians and how they play their music during the acute phase of a psychedelic trip. And while most of them can't.
Right. I was gonna say.
So some of these things are, I'm not saying that they're, you know, not there, but it's sometimes hard to quantify them in a scientific way.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Any other findings from your study before I ask about upcoming studies?
Um, so I think we covered quite quite a few of the studies. No, I mean, of course, I could go on for days talking about the results, but that would probably that's probably a little bit out of the time frame of the podcast.
So, what we'll say from this study, to sum it up, you found that things more like working memory, more kind of the intellect, that kind of functioning, even slightly impaired, but social functioning or social cognition improves.
Yes,
Which,
absolutely.
yeah, which you said is important in a therapeutic sense. Like, and but also funny because so many people, when they think about microdosing, when they think about LSD, they often think of microdosing because, like you alluded to, the journey on LSD can be, 10, 12 hours, very, like you said, there's not a whole lot you can do on it. And so when people are thinking about what's the use in my life, very often they think about microdosing, and they think about doing it for those working memory type or those focus type things that the science isn't necessarily showing. Are there any, do you know if there are any, I know there's a microdosing study that's more like a clinical one going on in New Zealand that's going to take data from people who are doing it, but do you know any upcoming ones that are with folks like yourself who are doing maybe imaging?
Oh yes, we just published one recently in collaboration with University of Chicago. And so what we found there is that the effects on brain connectivity are subtle, which is expected because it's a very low dose. We didn't find any changes in this thalamic connectivity that I was talking before under the full dose of LSD, which is something again which to be expected because the filtering function of the thalamus, if that doesn't work, it should really induce an altered state of consciousness. And this is exactly the idea of microdosing, that you are still, in a functional level and not go into this altered state of consciousness. But what we have found is that there is a change between the amygdala, which is basically the emotional center of our brain, to prefrontal areas. And I think that is really interesting because, as we discussed before, emotions are terribly important. Um, Especially when we're thinking about depression, for example. And there, well, if we take these results, there might indeed be a benefit for, especially for people who, for example, are depressed. I'm very keen to see the results in clinical populations. I think they probably have more, or might eventually have, more interesting findings, or more value than using LSD for ball self optimization.
That makes sense. And what is your hope on like the next frontier of LSD research? What kind of things are you all embarking on there, or what kind of things would you like to see investigated?
I mean, the next big step that everyone is really interested in right now are, of course, the clinical studies. Um, and I think they are terribly important. We are now conducting two studies with psilocybin, one with depressed individuals and the other one with alcohol addicted patients. And I think there is a huge potential to for these substances, especially with the. I mean, it would be a whole new concept with a 1 or 2 time administration, and hopefully will make people feel better for a pretty long time. So these studies are important. They are currently being conducted mainly with psilocybin because of, you mentioned it already, the long duration um, of LSD. So that is pretty big dedication with LSD for the patient as well as for the therapist, of course. So that's why most of these studies are being conducted with psilocybin. And so this will be the next big step to see if there is actual clinical value in these substances. And then the other thing that I find very important based on this is not only to see if they can help people, but also to find out why they do. Um, because in psychiatry, we've long made the mistake to just accept that some drugs work and others don't, and we didn't necessarily care too much why. And I think the why will eventually be the most interesting part of this, because if we want to help people, and if we then we need to understand what exactly is helping them, and based on this develop new medication or even non-pharmacological treatment options. So I think, and here with psychedelics, I think we really have this one opportunity to really look into it, to really understand what is helping, because it has so many levels, right? So we have the subjective experience, we have the pharmacology and everything, and finding out what is actually therapeutic about it will be a huge challenge, but also a huge opportunity. And yeah, I think that is these would be the next two really big steps. And then, of course, there's also big interest in how do these substances, well, hopefully improve healthy people's lives, right? Um, and these are all still very, very open questions. I mean, research on these compounds has basically re-emerged more or less recently, and there's still very few studies out there. And yeah, we definitely need more studies to be able to answer all these open questions.
I appreciate that very much. I am so grateful for you coming on and for everything that you shared. I have learned a ton out of this. Like you said, a lot of work has been done with psilocybin, and you hear about that a little more often, but LSD research is fascinating, and I look forward to hearing what what your new studies are, and are there any studies you're enrolling for that we can send people to you?
So the issue here is a bit that while the people need to speak German for the studies we're conducting in Switzerland, um, just because the questionnaires and everything is validated in the German language. So that is always it's. I mean, I'm so grateful. So many people are writing from all over the world asking if they can participate, and it's always very saddening for me to have to tell them, well, I'm so sorry, but you need to be a German speaker to participate. So maybe we can extend this program at one point to also be allowed to enroll English speakers. But if there is a German speaker out there and they want to participate, please contact me.
Fantastic. We will put a link to your institution's website and where they can contact you. All of my German audience. I thoroughly appreciate you spending this time with us.
Well, thank you so much. This was really great. Thank you.
I appreciate it so much. All right, for everybody else out there, until next time.